Hello, everyone. Welcome. File in here. Welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 543rd New Social Environment. I'm Carolyn, the Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Debra Bricker Balken and Eleanor Heartney. We are thrilled to welcome poet Zane Koss here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter and that here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We encourage you to check the chat for a living document of resources and actions. Over the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has undertaken a miraculous journey bringing together in a single monthly publication art, music, dance, film, theater, and literature, along with thoughtful social and political meditations. As a small nonprofit, we need your support. Your contribution will directly support our writers, guest artists, production staff, and operations here at the Rail. Please check the chat for more information and links to donate. And now to introduce today's guests and host. Debra Bricker Balken's award-winning books include Philip Guston's Poor Richard and Abstract Expressionism, Movements in Modern Art, among many others. She has received fellowships from the Clark Art Institute, the Dedalus Foundation, Creative Capital, and the Andy Warhol Foundation, among others. Eleanor Heartney is the author of numerous books on contemporary art. Heartney is an editor-at-large for the Rail, a contributing editor for Art in America, and has written extensively for publications including Art News and the New York Times. She is author and co-author of several books such as Art in Today and Postmodern Heretics, the Catholic Imagination in Contemporary Art. And with that, I'll pass it along to you, Eleanor.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Carolyn, and welcome everyone. So I hope will be a very stimulating conversation. I guess, maybe I'll say at the outset that for me, it's really kind of exciting to finally, have this public conversation with Debra, because Debra and I have been having private conversations about Rosenberg for many years. And I think we'll maybe get into this a little bit later, but we've known each other for 40 years now, I think, or thereabouts. We went to graduate school together. And we have, kind of our careers have sort of moved, I guess, in certain ways in tandem. And so I've been able to be kept apprised of the progress of Debra's incredible biography. And I know just from the many conversations we've had over the years, what a prodigious amount of work went into the creating of this book. And here, in fact, is the cover of the book. It's really quite a monumental achievement. And so what I guess I wanted to start, Debra, by asking you to talk about a little bit is that you've always described this book as an intellectual biography. And you want to elucidate a little bit, what's the difference between an intellectual biography and a straight biography? And how does this book fit that bill?
Okay, well, a straight biography narrates in a chronological fashion the events of a subject's life. And there's very little interpretation, if any interpretation, of those events at all. So as I wanted to reclaim Rosenberg as a major mid-century thinker, I opted to write an intellectual biography. And my book ties together key episodes from Rosenberg's life with an analysis of social and cultural and political history, as well as considering the kind of broader arc of his career. So it's both idea-based and event-based, I would say. Yeah,
and if anyone has, those of you who have already had a chance to take a look at the book, you'll see it's just it's teeming with information, with events, with characters, with ideas. And when it first came out and I read it, I said to Debra, you know, it reminds me of a Russian novel in the sense that it has so many different characters. And I was curious about how you managed to keep them all straight. How did you, organizing this kind of material? I mean, it's really such a huge and formidable task. How did you go about figuring out how you're going to present all of this?
Well, I ended up writing, a chronological take on Rosenberg. I had initially thought about opening the book with his key essay, The American Action Painters, that he wrote in 1952, and moving backwards and forwards in time, but abandoned that, although I did write those chapters actually first. So it allowed me this opportunity to think about the various figures, the various texts, the various events, that had populated his life and career as a writer from the late 1920s onwards until 78 when he dies.
One of the things that, of course, was very striking to me is how much of the book he is not actually an art critic, that right. In fact, he wrote about so many other things, and really the art criticism was largely, it was later, and right. And even in the later years, he was writing about a lot of other kinds of things. And to me, that was kind of a revelation, that he was such a figure in kind of the intellectual life across the board of his time.
Right. Well, that's interesting because Rosenberg is primarily known for one or two essays, The American Action Painters, the essay that puts him on the literary map in 1952. But prior to that point in time, he had worked both as a poet. He actively wrote poetry throughout the decade of the 30s for publications such as Poetry Magazine, for the Partisan Review, for other little magazines like the New Masses. But he also doubled as both a poet and as a literary and political commentator. And it wasn't until he was actually asked in 1952 or commissioned in 1952 to write The American Action Painters for Jean-Paul Sartre's publication, Les Temps Modernes, for which Rosenberg was named the American correspondent in 1948, that he began to immerse himself in more fully in an art scene. He had known many artists, throughout the decade of the 30s and 40s, but this was the seminal essay that actually brought together myriad ideas that he had been thinking about that related to the nature of mid-century painting, mid-century American painting, I should say.
Right. Well, and one of the things, I mean, that, I guess went into, again, that the later art writing was so much of his earlier political writing. And one thing that struck me very much, of course, in the book is his relationship to Marxism. Yes. And it was a very interesting and sort of complex one. And you draw, I think, a fascinating picture of the way in which sort of in the pre-war period, the interwar period, how, the Communist Party was a very strong force in the contemporary art world. And then, of course, afterwards, you have the Cold War, and then you had everyone sort of retreating and running away from the idea of communism and Marxism. But I mean, Rosenberg sort of stood outside those trends kind of at both periods. You want to talk a little bit about his relationship to Marxism?
Well, Rosenberg begins to read Marx in the late 1920s, actually, and while he's convalescing from a disease, osteomyelitis. And it's during that period of time when he is literally bedridden for a year and a half that he begins to rethink his earlier aspirations to be a lawyer. He went to the Brooklyn Law School and become a poet. But someone hands him a copy of the Communist Manifesto, and he's galvanized, and he begins to become an avid student of Marx. And But unlike many of his peers, he will never join the Communist Party. He will remain what we would refer to as a non-aligned Marxist, nor did he even become a fellow traveler. That is, somebody who is sympathetic to Marxist thought, but doesn't become, an active member, of the party. And in fact, part of his aversion to the Communist Party, which would intensify throughout the decade of the 1930s into the early 1940s, was because Rosenberg, well, first of all, thought that there was a tragic flaw in Marx's writing, and that was he made no accommodation for the individual. So it was really his goal to rewrite Marx's theory and replace the proletariat with the individual. But there were so many events that shaped this position during the decade of the 30s, and that was Rosenberg's not only observation but deep experience of the infiltration of the Communist Party into numerous literary and artistic circles and publications. And in fact,
I would say that really surprised me. I wasn't aware of the extent of that, and in a way, then it makes the later, kind of McCarthyism, you realize what that's coming out of. But please go ahead.
Exactly. And so, Rosenberg, who was, temperamentally, fearless and would take on any individual or any audience affiliated with the CP, began to be threatened by the Communist Party. Literally goon squads were sent out after him to try to stifle, his very public declaration against the Communist Party. But where this primarily stems from is during the decade of the 30s. I mean, he begins to see the way in which Marxist thought has literally been debased or perverted, by the rise of authoritarian regimes in Europe. And he's particularly interested in impugning a dictator like Stalin, who he felt had completely misread Marx.
Right. And then in the post-war era, I mean, what's interesting is how many of the, I guess the intellectuals who had embraced Marxism then fled from it and repudiated it. People like Hilton Kramer and even, I don't know who else.
Clement Greenberg would be
right, especially Clement Greenberg. So again, and then. I mean, what's interesting is it's sort of like Rosenberg seemed to sort of hold fast to his idea, and you see the other kind of intellectuals sort of swaying with the times.
Right, exactly. Well, some of these other figures who will give up on their earlier communist affiliations are Philip Robb and Philip Robb and William Phillips, who are two of the co-founders of the Partisan Review, which is a restructured former communist publication that resurfaces in 1937. And Rosenberg will begin to write for that publication very early on. His editor will be Dwight MacDonald, who was not a communist, and nor did he have communist leanings. He was essentially an anarchist. But as the publication became increasingly drained of its political coverage, Rosenberg ceased to be interested in it. And by 1944, his interest would migrate to other publications, such as Commentary magazine, which is launched in 1944. And unlike its present day conservative incarnation, it was a very progressive magazine in the mid-1940s.
Right.
And also, it hired a number of Marxist writers to publish, in its pages, including figures like Jean-Paul Sartre, who had also appeared in Partisan Review when it was still addressing contemporary political events.
Right. And Sartre was another figure who, in the end, I guess Rosenberg sort of had they had been close, and then they had a split over this issue as Sartre went towards the French Communist Party.
Yes. So what happens is Rosenberg actually meets Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, one of the other co-founders of Les Temps Modernes, in New York. She is in New York in 1947 on her so-called American literary tour. She meets him, Rosenberg, at a party at Dwight McDonald's house on East 10th Street. And she writes back to Sartre and she says, "I've met the only American existentialist." And she has this deep hostility towards the editors of the Partisan Review. She refers to their magazine as a worthless imperialist rag, but she carries Rosenberg's name back to Sartre, and very quickly he becomes associated with the publication. Maurice Merleau-Ponty becomes his editor until 1952, and that is, shortly after he had been commissioned to write the American Action Painters for Les Temps. Sartre declares his interest and support, not affiliation, but support of the French Communist Party. And that was just something Rosenberg couldn't countenance. So he severs his relationship with the magazine until the late 1950s, when their friendship resumes.
Wow. Yeah. Well, and as you're telling the story, of course, one thing that is striking to me as a writer is kind of the role that these different magazines played in the intellectual life, and kind of what it meant to be a public intellectual at that time. I mean, it was such a different landscape than it is now. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, I mean, there was a sense that both literature and art, existed in a state of crisis, being threatened, by these collectives such as the Communist Party, that there was, how did one exert his or her individuality or subjectivity, in the face of these huge collectives that had enormous power. And so there was this deep sense of urgency that I think attended literary and art criticism during the 30s and 40s until we get to the 1950s, and that situation begins to gradually change. Rosenberg will write a key essay in 1948 for Commentary magazine called "The Herd of Independent Minds," and he'll note the way in which the rise of the new criticism, or formalism as we refer to it in the art world, is beginning to become a dominant interpretive trend. And Rosenberg feels that as a result, these public intellectuals are becoming increasingly conventional, if not conformist in their thinking.
Right. And so, of course, this brings us to Clement Greenberg, the foremost formalist.
Right.
And I mean, what's sort of curious about the way things have unfolded, in many ways, Greenberg is, he's sort of much more known in a way than Rosenberg in the contemporary art world. Now, at one time, I guess, because his theories were so much in ascendance. Now, because postmodernism tends to just define itself against Greenberg. Why do you think that is, that Greenberg remained, in a way, this kind of touchstone, and Rosenberg, I mean, this is the first really substantive book about Rosenberg. There's a lot of books about Greenberg.
Right.
Why? What was that all about?
Well, it's interesting. When Rosenberg writes the American Action Painters in 1952, it will eventually appear in Art News. So he'll withdraw it from Les Temps. He will show it to Elaine de Kooning, who is a writer for Art News, who will carry the manuscript to Tom Hess. And within 3 months of Hess reading this essay, it will be published in the pages of Art News. And once it appears, everybody wants to be thought of as an action painter. I mean, Pollock, Jackson Pollock felt that, he had appropriated this notion of action from him, given the kind of performative aspects of Pollock's painting. But action, of course, is a word that Rosenberg had used, throughout the decade of the 30s and 40s, which is a word that actually in 1952 is still tinged with, existential sobriety. So throughout the decade of the 1950s, Rosenberg is an ascendant critic, and Greenberg becomes deeply threatened, by his ascendance. And it's not until the early 1960s, with the founding of a publication, Art Forum, where Greenberg's ideas will become institutionalized through a second generation of Greenbergian writers, that Greenberg will begin to experience some kind of a revival. And Rosenberg will still maintain his visibility, but it will be through another publication, namely the New Yorker.
Right. Well, and I think one of the things too that, and because I was just thinking about this problem, and part of it is, I mean, Rosenberg was in a way he was a much more flexible, much more protean kind of writer. He didn't have sort of a line, in the way that Greenberg did. And so even, I mean, in the book, you talk a lot about action, and that's kind of the leitmotif that goes through the book, is the idea of action. But even, later he came to a point where he felt that this idea of action wasn't really relevant anymore.
Right.
And so he didn't, he couldn't maybe be associated, in a way with a simple idea, in the way that, Greenberg and the idea of formalism and flatness and all of that, it was much easier to codify in a way.
Right.
I mean, it was hard maybe to codify his,
Well, as an existentialist, I mean, he placed a great deal of emphasis on the ephemeral unfolding of a work of art, and so hence his ideas were evascent, unlike formalism, which had a material component to it. It was about the description of the pictorial ingredients of a work of art. Rosenberg, as he says in the American Action Painters, action and mid-century American painting or art is about anything, be it biography, be it psychology, be it about one's spirituality. It's about anything other than art criticism. And what he's beginning to sense there, and it was a very prescient, observation actually, because by the time we get to the 60s, we're going to be finding, some artists are going to be enacting formalist ideas in their work.
Right.
Which will also begin to, to add to Greenberg's renewed authority.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it was almost like he'd created a formula that you could follow, and also I think maybe in the way in which Greenberg used the institutions to support his people, and it doesn't seem like Rosenberg did that in quite the same way.
Well, the marketplace could not appropriate Rosenberg's ideas in the same way that they could appropriate formalist art criticism, which was aesthetic based, which was deprived of context, which was deprived of linking a work of art to, a cultural or social or political event or episode.
Right. Well, and in a sense, it's exactly that aspect of Rosenberg that makes him interesting to us today, is and that he was about the context, and he was about the social world in which an artwork took place,
right,
which of course was the opposite of Greenberg.
Right, exactly. But, just to pick up on what you were stating earlier about, the time in which this word action drops out of Rosenberg's vocabulary, it's in the late 1960s. And just to back up, in 1962, Rosenberg was invited to spell Robert Coates, who was the resident art critic for the New Yorker, who was on medical leave. And after Coates recuperates and comes back and resumes his position, Rosenberg will write a few literary pieces for the New Yorker. But when Coates retires in 1967, William Shawn, the editor of the New Yorker, will name Rosenberg as the resident art critic for the publication. And he begins to assess, this art scene. And it's largely, a New York art scene. He begins to realize that action no longer has any currency. He's already written a key article called The American Art Establishment in 1965 for Esquire magazine, where he looks at, the entangled network of curators and dealers and artists and the academy and, the key critics who are writing for this establishment. So, this word no longer has the former urgency that it used to have, and it drops out of his vocabulary.
Right. And at that point, I mean, he begins to kind of create what we now would, I guess, call, institutional critique. I mean,
Right,
there's a lot of, and again, that's something that I think is something that is sort of irrelevant about his writings today. In fact, we are so kind of enmeshed in the notion of institutional critique.
Right.
But that was something that I guess around the time of the New Yorker that he really began to be concerned with that.
Use the New Yorker partly as a platform to rail against the institutionalization of formalist ideas, both within the academy and within the museum world. And noting that, formalist art criticism, which is politically neutral, will aid and abet a marketplace. And so consequently, he will begin to look at the figures who are woven into these new mega exhibitions. This is the era of the mega exhibition, and who gets left out and why. So there's a lot about the politics of exclusion that he is also able to weave into his analysis of these major shows that take place in New York.
Right. Yeah. And again, kind of from my perspective as an art critic, reading the book was so interesting to see, I guess, also that the changing kind of role of criticism that, and of course, as we were saying early on, he wasn't specifically an art critic, but he was a cultural critic. Right. But, that in the earlier writings, it feels like it was somehow kind of much more vital to the culture in a way that then when you begin, even at the time of the New Yorker, it's become its own, it's a little ghetto in a way. I mean, it doesn't seem like it has the sort of urgency that the earlier writing did.
Well, I think in part because, Rosenberg comes of age during the decade of the 1930s, the era of the Great Depression, the era of the rise of totalitarian regimes, which will ultimately culminate in a world war. And it will, in that war will last until 1945. And so consequently, there was this, again, this deep sense of crisis that attended the interpretation of any work of art or text. And by the late 1960s, when he assumes his post at the New Yorker, that crisis is, completely dissipated.
Right, and art and art in the larger sense, I guess, in literary art, whatever, it's playing a very different kind of role in culture at that point.
Right. Right. So he really feels, although he will never give up on his Marxism, he remains, what we would refer to as an ethical Marxist. He's drawn to, notions of, economic parity and social justice. He will use his, ongoing deep interest in Marx and his dialectical methods to, talk about the way in which, the museum, whatever its claims to neutrality, is a deeply compromised and contested site.
Right. Yeah. And I wanted to also kind of bring in our personal relationship to this situation when we came into the story. I was particularly interested, of course, towards the end of the book when you talk about in his sort of last phase. He's writing for the New Yorker, and he starts also teaching at the University of Chicago.
Right.
And of course, this is where you and I met. And in an odd coincidence, when I went to University of Chicago as an undergraduate, and then later graduate school, which is where we met. As an undergraduate, my first year, I had a work study class, and I was assigned to show slides at art history class, and it turned out to be his class. So at this point, I was, just fresh from Des Moines, Iowa. I didn't really know much about anything, but I remember him very well. It was so striking, you describe him very well, this sort of incredibly imposing figure, but with this strange kind of high rasping voice with a thick New York accent. I can still hear it in my head. And he was a riveting lecturer. I remember at one point I was showing a slide, and I was sort of so transfixed that they had to sort of nudge me to get me to keep going. He was very, very interesting. So as I say, at that point, I wasn't really involved in art history, didn't really know what I was going to be doing, in terms of what my major was. But I went out and I was very impressed by the fact, of course, that he was writing for the New Yorker. And so I went and, I got some of his books of essays, and again, found them to be, very interesting. And also, again, for someone like me who was not, I was not privy to all of the debates. I found them very understandable, which was, I think also one of his legacies as a critic is, that he was able to write in such a kind of fluid and clear way, which is why he could be successful at the New Yorker. Anyway, fast forward. Okay, I graduated, did not go into art history as an undergraduate, worked a couple of years, went back to school as in art history at the University of Chicago. And as it happened, that was you and I met in that program. He had just died, prior. So we were unable then to take his classes. Right. But what was interesting, and your book, I think, really illuminated this also, was that we probably wouldn't have anyway, because we were really discouraged by that art history department from, taking a class from someone who didn't have a PhD and wasn't really sort of sufficiently, kind of connoisseurship oriented or whatever. And I thought, that again, your description, I think, of kind of his struggles in academia were very interesting. Right. And instead of the art history department, he found a home in the Committee for Social Thought, which was much more friendly to his way of thinking.
Right. Well, the Committee of Social Thought, which is this elite committee, graduate committee, at the University of Chicago, invites Rosenberg to become a part-time professor in 1967. It was largely through two friends of his who served on that committee, Hannah Arendt and Saul Bellow. And Rosenberg had only taught once earlier in his life. It was in 1952 at the New School. He taught a seminar on Melville and Whitman. So this was his first real sustained teaching experience. And when he gets to Chicago, he absolutely adores the intellectual community, at the school, primarily because of this one committee, which encourages independent thought. And but as somebody who was just becoming the art critic for the New Yorker, he also wanted an affiliation with the art history department. They did not want him, but they had to take him. And, as you said, Rosenberg didn't have a PhD. He didn't even have a graduate degree. He had a law degree. And for a department that was largely composed of connoisseurs when we were there, Rosenberg was, a complete anathema to them. They had no respect for the New Yorker at all. Most of them were not even significantly well published. I think some of them had only written a handful of articles, but they were fully tenured, and they did everything to try to boot him out of that department, such as scheduling required attendance at guest lectures during the time period of his class, Mm-hmm. So, but Rosenberg had sort of had it with them by 1978, and he had accepted actually an appointment in the English department at Hunter College, which he was supposed to assume in the fall of 1978. But over the summer, he he dies of a stroke. He had,
Right.
he'd been in failing health. Actually, he had diabetes, he had severe arthritis, and that on top of this earlier condition that afflicted him as a child, osteomyelitis, which left him with a game leg, and he walked with a cane throughout most of his life.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, so.
But you know what I'm struck by too, Eleanor, when I got there was very little memory of Rosenberg within the art history department. I mean, I didn't know many of the, students who were about to graduate with their doctorates. I mean, they must have had, well, they did have a memory of him, but it was interesting the way in which they really scrubbed his ideas completely from that program by the time we got there.
Right. And so, in fact, your interest in him then came much later. It was even though we had, been there.
Right.
Just
well, yeah. I mean, I worked on two projects that related to Philip Guston. One, an exhibition of his poem pictures or his collaborations with writers and poets. And then subsequently, I worked on the Guston-Nixon drawings. And in both projects, Rosenberg's name kept surfacing and resurfacing. And I kept asking myself, why has nothing been written on this, this phenomenal thinker? I mean, he was one of the few critics who was able to interpret Guston's late work, that is his, so-called, cartoon type imagery, with any kind of real depth, and seeing it more as a continuity that existed within Guston's career rather than as an aberration. He writes this wonderful review of Guston's show at the Marlborough Gallery that was widely condemned. The title of his review is Liberation from Detachment. And I thought, my God, what a poetic way of talking about somebody who had reneged on abstract painting. So that is how I got to Rosenberg. And then as I was beginning to, work in the early stages of research, I had this repressed memory that, my God, Rosenberg taught at the graduate school that I went to.
Right. I know. I mean, it's you just feel, sort of history kind of.
Right.
Yeah, we kind of missed it there. But then, anyway, yeah, but it was, it was interesting to read how you kind of, sort of put all that together. And so you've worked on this book for what, 15 years, something like that?
I worked on it off and on for 20 years. I started writing in 2005 after I had enough research behind me to begin working on some early chapters for the book, which actually became chapters that are situated sort of midway through his career. But, the Rosenberg archive, while vast, is by no means complete. And there are significant gaps in his papers. And so I consulted about 50 other archives to piece together this narrative account of his life and thought.
Well, and I think that's one of the, I mean, the book has many wonderful virtues, but one of them, I think that book is really going to be so useful because it's not just about Rosenberg. I mean, you have really kind of recreated the intellectual climate of that time through, I mean, the letters, the correspondences, the interconnections, again, going back to kind of the Russian novel idea. I mean, right. It's not just Rosenberg, but it's within this whole larger field. And sort of you must have been sort of living in that world for a while.
I was, literally for 15 years, but I have to say that I never tired of my subject. He was endlessly compelling to me. And it's fascinating you mentioned Dostoevsky, because Rosenberg did teach a class on Dostoevsky at Chicago. It was the first class he taught on a single author. He was so taken by, all of his novels.
I read that in your book and I thought, God, I wish I could have taken that class. I mean, that sounded amazing. Yeah, and again, you can't imagine any of the art historians in our department being able to do something like that.
Right, no. I can't.
So, yeah. So now, now that you're done with the book, do you miss Rosenberg, or is it?
Well, I do miss Rosenberg somewhat, although I have carried him with me to a few other projects. I'm working currently as a lead curator on a project, Americans in Paris, from 1946 to 62 for the Gray Art Gallery. And I open with another essay by Rosenberg for that project, his essay, The Fall of Paris, which was written in 1940 for the Partisan Review, where Rosenberg actually begins to rethink and reconstruct time. Time, up until 1940 had generally thought to have a kind of progressive teleological unfolding. Rosenberg in this essay begins to construct time as fragmented and ruptured given this event. And he will also predict in that essay that New York will become the next art capital.
Wow. Yeah. So, I mean, he's anticipating postmodernism, certainly.
He absolutely is. Yes. So, I mean, and I do have plans for Rosenberg for a few other projects too.
Well, that's good. I know.
Yeah.
I mean, because I can imagine it would be hard to say goodbye.
Yeah, there's so much research here that I still have something to build on, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so I think our audience here has a lot of young, artists, probably critics, writers. What would you say for them is the kind of, how does Rosenberg speak to them, or what does he have to offer for them?
Well, it's interesting because, again, Rosenberg's ideas, can't be codified, they can't be pinned down. And he himself, questioned, late in his life, whether his writing would exert any kind of influence. And he came to the realization that it probably would not. What he wanted to be remembered, though, for was engaging in what he referred to as an ongoing discussion or debate about key issues that confront one's time. And it's where I think Rosenberg has become a particularly relevant figure at this moment, especially as, we are talking about, issues that relate to economic and social justice. But again, it's this word debate that, he hoped that would be associated with him. And I actually think that there are a lot of younger writers right now in publications which are debate focused and oriented, such as the Brooklyn Rail.
Right, there you go. Exactly. Yeah, and again, that's an interesting thing too, because I in reading the book and all the different sort of the little magazines, these were not kind of major magazines, but were very important within these kinds of debates. And I was thinking about, do we, how does the current landscape, of criticism compare? And in many ways, it's, you don't have a lot of these sort of broader, kind of broader scoped literary publications. And you're right, Brooklyn Rail is sort of one of the few, because it covers not just art, but it covers, again, this whole waterfront. But that the idea that, I mean, these were many of the little magazines that he wrote for, they had very specific agendas and specific points of view, and so they were kind of created to, create this sort of debate between themselves. And you don't tend to see that so much today, maybe because it's just so diffuse, because publications are not, I don't know. I mean, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I think there are a number of reasons. I mean, I think, when Rosenberg wrote The American Action Painters in 1952, the art world was so small in New York. There were a handful of galleries, on 57th Street. There were very few museums, with the exception of the Museum of Modern Art in the Whitney, who were organizing exhibitions devoted to modern and contemporary work. So the scene was much smaller. And, all of these figures knew everyone, whether they got along or not. I mean, this is a story of, of course, of collapsing friendships, given the kinds of deep divisions, political divisions that would occur, especially during the McCarthy era. in the late 1940s to early 1950s. But I think it's really this notion of a marketplace that begins to divide them.
Yeah, and of course that we have that with vengeance now.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So yeah, in a way, I remember hearing, I think it was Jerry Saltz say a number of years ago, the market is the critic now, and so maybe that's part of it as well. That
or the collector is the critic.
Yeah. Now it's not. Yeah, it's the collector has sort of become the arbiter in a way that. Greenberg certainly tried to be, but of course Greenberg was very much more tied to the market, I think, than Rosenberg.
The marketplace in that he was an advisor for so many collections during the 1960s.
Right. Yeah. Whereas Rosenberg, I think, kept himself away from that. I mean, he was very artist focused, but he wasn't so much, art market focused or art.
He very briefly worked as a consultant for John Graham, who started a gallery of contemporary art that didn't last more than a year. But Rosenberg wasn't on Graham's payroll, actually. I mean, it was really just his job to recommend artists who he thought that Graham should be exhibiting, such as Pearl Fine and Alice Neal and others.
Yeah. And because of that, I think he struggled financially for so many years until he got the New Yorker job, right?
Until he got the New Yorker job.
Yeah. So, I mean,
well, but there is one thing. He did have a part-time day job, and his part-time day job was working for the American Ad Council.
Oh, that's
and,
right.
That grows out of his work during the war for the Office of War Information. After Rosenberg is on the Federal Writers Project and that project dissolves, he is transferred to the Office of War Information and which is a propaganda, machine. And it will very interestingly evolve into the present day American Ad Council. And the head of the American Ad Council, a man by the name of George Ludlam, who he had worked with at the OWI, convinced him to come with him part-time because he said, how are you going to support yourself writing criticism? And, but Rosenberg also really adored working for the American Ad Council. And as I explore in the book, there are very direct links between the various campaigns that he oversaw. He never wrote an ad campaign, and his writing. And I think that's reflected, in the kind of pithy titles that he gave, many of his articles and essays, like The Herd of Independent Minds, The Anxious Object, The Twilight of the Intellectuals, The American Action Painters, it goes on and on. The American Org Man.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, so I guess he was probably, I mean, it's funny to think of him working for an ad council and as a Marxist. I mean, there's sort of, but
well, how do you ethical advertising?
Right, exactly, yeah. Well, I guess before we turn to the questions, just one thing. If you could speak to Rosenberg today, is there something you'd ask him or say to him?
What would I ask him? I feel like I've asked him so many questions over the years through my writing. I don't have one particular question I'd ask him today.
Right. But we probably have people
who know what he would say about the contemporary art world, so.
Right. Well, yeah, you probably have a pretty good idea what he would have to say. Yeah. So I think we can move on maybe now to the questions. And I think, Carolyn, you're gonna be in charge of that.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you both so much. This is fascinating. So our first question, I would love to turn it over to Pamela. Let me make sure. Can you unmute? I can't find you. Let's see, Pamela. Oh, there you go.
I'm unmuted.
Yeah, okay.
Hi, everybody. My question is for Debra. Can you please say something about how Rosenberg selected the artists that he championed?
Okay, well, the American Action Painters is a text that does not name names because it was written for a French publication. He felt that the French audiences would not be acquainted with a Jackson Pollock or a de Kooning or whoever. So but gradually he does reveal that the American action painters is about figures, you know, like de Kooning, Hoffman, Pollock, Newman, and various other figures. You know, Rosenberg writes a short book on Gorky in 1962. It's the first monographic study that he will write on an artist. But he knew Gorky. He meets Gorky in the late he meets him just before he dies in the late 1940s, and he thinks about Gorky throughout the entire decade of the 50s. Wondering if Gorky is an action painter, because Gorky, after all, is somebody who is appropriating, you know, pictorial passages from Mata and from Picasso and others. And in that essay, he very presciently begins to predict the whole advent of postmodernism in the late 1960s, in that he feels that, you know, action is just not bound to originality or to the elaboration of one singularity, but it also can come through digesting pre-existing pictorial sources. So Gorky is somebody who's deeply drawn to. At the end of his life, he will write monographic studies on Barnett Newman, on Willem de Kooning, and on Saul Steinberg. But I should say that when Rosenberg gets to the New Yorker, he is bound to writing about exhibitions that are being scored or assembled by the major showcases in New York. So these in some ways are not his choices. So the first review that he will write for the New Yorker is of a Mark Tobey exhibition, actually, at the Museum of Modern Art. And he has a very dismissive view of Tobey, something that I actually found myself disagreeing with Rosenberg about, because I organized a Mark Tobey retrospective a few years ago, and I think that Rosenberg actually missed the mark on Tobey. But of course he did have a distinct sense of a coterie of artists in mind. And these were the artists who he met on the WPA during the decade of the 30s. He meets de Kooning. He's actually made de Kooning's studio assistant by Harry Holtzman, because Holtzman wants to give Rosenberg a job. Rosenberg, you know, had produced a few paintings and watercolors, you know, to get onto the project. They weren't successful, so he made him de Kooning's assistant. They will remain lifelong friends. Rosenberg will remain devoted to de Kooning at every turn. But it's really this coterie or cohort of artists that we associate with the New York School that will remain, which he will champion, you know, at every possible turn throughout his career. There are, of course, other artists in the 60s that he will write about. It's interesting to me that Alan Capro is somebody who becomes tied to Rosenberg. Capro's deeply interested in, you know, the poetics of Rosenberg's language and how he gets to terms like action, which he thinks are predecessors for his term happenings. But no, it's this mid-century group that he will remain devoted to.
He loved artists.
He loved artists. He did.
Yeah.
I think that's clear in his writing too.
Yeah, it is. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you both so much. Our next question is from Theodore. I'm going to read the question for him. So he said, Debra, can you talk about the Robert Motherwell's elegy to the Spanish Republic #1 and other artists who use Rosenberg's words/ideas? And he says, thanks for your book.
Okay. Well, Rosenberg and Robert Motherwell, along with John Cage and Pierre Charot, the mid-century French architect, launched a publication in the late 1940s called Possibilities that ended up only going through one issue. Rosenberg and Motherwell, disagreed about the content of the publication, although a second publication was planned. And for that publication, Motherwell actually incorporated a few lines into a drawing that became the precursor for his entire Spanish elegy series, and is something that's illustrated in the book.
Great, thank you, Debra. And next, we'd love to turn it over to our friend G.E. Schwartz.
Thank you so much, Carolyn and Eleanor and Debra. I have been enchanted by his writing since I came upon it in the mid-70s. With the article on kitsch that was in Dissent magazine that happened to be in the library stacks at the college I was at. But at any rate, and it just blew my mind and changed my whole way of culturally looking at a lot of things. But I always wondering, was his ambition and his sense of crisis the kind of perfect blend that gave Rosenberg his directive force?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I wonder if those world events and crises had not taken place, if Rosenberg would become the critic that he became. I also wonder if he did not withdraw the American action painters from Les Temps Modernes, if it would have had the same reception in France that it did in the United States. I don't think so, because it would have been translated into French. There are not many French readers in this country at the time, at least within this group. And I don't think that it would have galvanized this coterie of artists in quite the same way.
Thank you.
Thank you, Debra and G. So for our final question, I would love to turn it over to our very own Fong Bui. Should be able. Let's see.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you, Debra. Wonderful book. I'm only halfway through, so I can't really have full entire read in order to ask in greater depth and question. But I wanted to ask some of the early activity. For example, when Bertrand Russell taught at CUNY, there was a consensus that really petitioned against him, which he finally left. And which to me is a very interesting period, because that's led right after the Moscow trial,
Right.
which basically split New York intellectual community right in half. This is long before even commentary came to bear. So it's interesting to think of 1936 to 38 when it took place. And so when Russell came to New York and failed to get that teaching job, it's interesting to think that Rosenberg was working for the Office of War Information. At the same time, Isaiah Berlin did similar for the British, war information or intelligence information. And he was teaching the same time, I think at Brandmore College. So it's interesting, the cross section of the two of them. And I wonder how much he was involved in CUNY, because CUNY was a hotbed of Jewish intellectual, leading Sidney Hook. Sidney Hook was so important to that whole firmament. So who also later, was the grandfather of neoconservatism.
Right.
So was there any relationship between them?
Well, Rosenberg went, went to CUNY for 1 year, but he was there. He was not there during the time that Hook was there, or even Barnett Newman was there, or some of the other figures who will be associated with the Partisan Review were at CUNY. But, in terms of the Moscow trials, which take place, as you mentioned, between 36 and 38, this is another huge issue, which will erupt in one of the many, debates that will happen over this period of time, that will divide this community of intellectuals. And Rosenberg, it will also be a reason why, Rosenberg will continue to rail against the Communist Party. Once it is exposed that so many Russian intellectuals and members of the Red Army and artists were sent to a gulag and never seen again. And it was at that moment, this defining moment, when some intellectuals who were members of the Communist Party will renege on those allegiances and become what we would refer to now as, I suppose, neoliberals. Hooke is somebody, though, who had his origins as a Marxist. Rosenberg and Hooke knew each other from the late 1920s. They both appear in a publication called Symposium magazine that was edited by James Burnham out of NYU, where Sidney Hooke will land a full-time teaching position in the philosophy department. But as the decade of the 30s goes on, Hooke will not only give up on his communist interests, but he will become, by the end of the decade, what we now refer to as a neoconservative.
Yeah, it's very dramatic with Hooke, knowing that he was the advisor of Reagan, with something that we tend to forget, that neoconservatism have roots in liberal Democrats.
Absolutely.
And by 1970 or so, it switched so dramatically, and we forgot that George W. Paul Wolfowitz, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld was serious practitioner because they all believed in the whole philosophy of Warhol, which have early roots in American aggression. But let me ask you also one other question, Debra, because I remember reading Whittaker Chambers. And there was a whole similar split between Eugene Debs and Whittaker Chambers. So how much was that involved in Rosenberg? Well,
I have a section in the book on Whittaker Chambers, who was also somebody who makes this transit from being, well, in his case, from being a liberal to a neoconservative. And it's another one of these many debates that is going to divide this whole community of intellectuals. A number will side with Whittaker Chambers, Rosenberg, and Hannah Arendt and Mary McCarthy are going to become opposed to the way in which they feel that he unnecessarily outed Alger Hiss. And the other thing that they're very opposed to in Chambers is Chambers begins to participate in what they refer to as these tell-all memoirs or biographies about these political transformations that take place within their lives. And they feel that this is really futile literature for the most part. But one other figure I wanted to mention too, Fong, who I think is important in terms of this discussion, is Norman Podhoretz, who will become the editor of Commentary magazine after Eliot Cohen dies in 1959. And Rosenberg had a very good run in writing for Commentary, and he will stick with Podhoretz up until the mid 1960s, as the war in Vietnam is beginning to escalate. And that will be another point of division between him, Podhoretz, and Commentary, and he will cease to publish for that magazine thereafter.
Yeah, the term cultural critic is rarely applied to any of such individual as Rosenberg, because I once had a long discussion with also Dory Aston, who always regard herself as a cultural critic, never not critic. She happened to write about art when a chance arose, but she insisted that when she wrote for the New York Times, they would send her to meet all kind of, world intellectual, Gavino, for example, or Sartre and other people. And it's something that we should reconsider, because it's not, it all exists in our generation, so to speak. It's
Well,
rare.
you know, because Rosenberg has his origins as a writer, you know, as a poet, and, you know, is profoundly identified with Poetry magazine up until 1940. Again, another transition. Harriet Monroe, the founding editor, has died by that point in time. George Dillon, the new editor, is not interested in Rosenberg's poetry. And Rosenberg actually gives up on poetry, but nonetheless, he will identify himself as a poet who writes about art until his affiliation with the New Yorker.
And that's where he gained so profound sympathy with Guston association with the poets.
Yes, exactly.
That you mentioned in your book too.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I can't wait. I'm gonna finish the other half of the book.
Great.
And you know, the conversation continues. Thank you, Debra.
Great. Thanks.
And congratulations on the book.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you. Back to you, Carolyn.
Thanks so much, Vaughn. That's a perfect way to transition to our closing poetry reading. We have a tradition of ending our community events at the Rail with reading, and today we are so thrilled to have poet Zane Koss with us. Zane Koss is the author of Harbor Grids from Invisible Press. He is co-translator of Hugo Garcia Manriquez's The Commonplace, and he is author of several chapbooks, including The Odes, Incomplete from Above Ground Press, which was shortlisted for the Nelson Ball Award. His poetry, translations, and essays can be found in Jacket 2, Chicago Review, Guernica, and elsewhere. So with that, I'm so happy to welcome Zane.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone at Brooklyn Rail for having me, especially Ty. And thank you to Debra and Eleanor for that fascinating conversation. I'm just going to be reading an excerpt from my book, Harbor Grids, which just came out like 2 weeks ago. So, and just as a bit of visual context, each of the poems are built on a 4x4 grid of the letter S. I don't know if that showed through in the video there, but you know, perhaps that's relevant context. Anyhow, thanks again. Part 1. Glassed looks a pure surface. Sent lines to scout under. Scanned depth topographies resolved into discrete layers with the eyes. Slate blue from the oblique slant of early December sun. Brown silted as mud plains spreading shore to shore. Wavers glanced, scan north to south. Speckled froth, rooster's feathers, folded paths, wet grass. 2 sailboats amid slashes of rain, whole sheets and swirls. Shining an outsized sliver, silver between horizons. Layers of blue stretch to graze, the shipyards set limits. Seen behind a wall of mist, tips of buildings, red and blue ships. The fog is a translucent vertical surface, connects across the far shoreline. A surface that just recedes. Feel the push of the water and how smoke from stoops drifts uphill against the cold air. Shimmering glimpse between blocks, scratched paths, harsh, dark, edgeless blue, dotted lines, white caps, iridescent black. Ships at anchor seem stranded, scattered across the shifting surface. Sunset wanes over freight cranes, New Jersey. Staten Island disappears. Slugs streak behind freighters. Furred surface sanded smooth. Soft. Distance. Silent. This complex, not just a surface, but signs and currents, data, a cosmos of paths submerged, gazing, guessing, no sense of this space as worked. The visible, partially observed, distorts. Always the orange Staten Island ferries, each slips, exchanges positions. Ships scan horizons like eyes reading, solid blue against pale block of sky. It ceases to exist in summer, one shimmering plane among others, shard of light. Horizon of sight contracts, smog sifted, city and sea blissfully hazed out. Part 2. This one's a little bit quicker. This city suddenly could exist. On a Tuesday, look up and see no stars. Wednesday morning, slosh brushing wet leaves from sidewalk. The sensory is a thin sheet clung to the skin like sweat. The skyline dissolved, steamy morning, sun not yet risen. Shrouding skyscrapers, souls squeak down front step into the street. Startled starling and sparrow don't sing except in sharp chirps. Low whistle. Rush of street sweeper, curbside, someone hacks spittle onto the sidewalk, percussive roar and blast, insistent thrum of airplanes over. Mr. Softy speakers hiss a song across the block, could speak and answer in gestures. Neither of us understand each other's. To cross which boundaries is neighborliness, which trespassing? To become distinguishable to a stranger, shouts small talk from a stoop, it's good weather this weekend. Summer soundtrack pushed from car stereo suffuses the street from open windows, the season slips. Bodies seeking sun burst onto sidewalks, citizen as city dweller, ciudadanos y ciudadanas, not legal status conferred by state. Practice speaking. Say it poorly. ¿Cómo estás? How could these grids be sufficient to this place? Will be insufficient to this place. ¿Cómo se dice landslide? Deslizamiento de land slid. Say it. Sun set. Suns set. Sunset Park. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zane. This is a really beautiful way to close. Yes, thank you all. Thank you, Debra and Eleanor, of course. Congratulations on the book. Thank you also to Kristen at the University of Chicago Press. We encourage everyone to watch the archive of these conversations. They'll be up on our YouTube channel shortly. And please join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Nikki Giovanni and Paul D. Miller on Earth Day. And you can now turn off your microphones and say goodbye as you leave. I'm sorry, turn on your microphones.
Thank you so much, Eleanor.
Thank you so
Deborah.
much.
Thank you.
Incredible reading.
Thank you, everybody, for
Thank you
coming.
so much, Deborah.
Thanks.
Thank you, Eleanor.
Thank you.
Eleanor, Deborah, thank you.
Thank you all so
Okay.
much.
Amazing reading.
All right.
Thank you.
Congratulations, Deborah.
And
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Zane.
Bye-bye,
Thank you, Deborah.
everyone.
Congratulations on the book.
Thanks, Bob.
Yes.
Go out and buy the book, you guys.
Ordered.
Read it.
Read
A
Great
great
to
book.
see you, Eleanor.
Yes. Okay.
Bye.
Thank you,
All
Deborah
right.
from Paris.
Thank you, you guys.
Thank you all. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.